Alexander, they vet everybody that runs for president.
Yes.
They vet everybody that enters a high position in the U.S. government.
Hmm.
We're seeing the Amy Coney Barrett trial. I mean, she's probably been investigated top to bottom, left to right, 10 times.
Yes.
We knew about Joe Biden, Joe
Yes.
Biden's past, and everybody knew about Hunter Biden and all the stuff that he was up to. This
Yes.
wasn't a secret. Back in 2013, 14, this wasn't a secret.
No.
Burisma wasn't a secret. No one reported on it, but it wasn't a secret.
Yeah.
Everyone knew there was corruption going down in Ukraine, a lot of corruption. Why the hell did they put Joe Biden to run for president? I mean, they must have known that this stuff is going to come out sooner or later. Are we getting played here?
May very well be. I mean, there are lots of possibilities. Maybe. I mean, I said that in most situations, Joe Biden would be, I mean, he would be out at this point. I mean, I can't imagine that, if this is, the United States that I used to remember, a candidate for the presidency exposed to this kind of scandal would remain a presidential candidate, even at this late point in the race. So it may be that he was placed there in the expectation that he would implode and would then make room for someone else. So it's possible that we're being played. It's also possible, though, and bear this in mind, that people knew about it. Of course, they knew about it. The Democrats would certainly have known about this, but that it gave them leverage over Biden, and that might also be a factor in play too. We will just have to wait and see how this plays out. For the moment, I think that what we need to do is to focus on these revelations themselves and to point out the absolutely critically important thing, which is that Joe Biden is clearly a wholly unfit person to become president of the United States. He may be, it's not just that he's dithery. He might have been once a sort of amiable person, but he is clearly someone who is, let's put it like this, under grave suspicion of corruption. Bear in mind, Donald Trump has been investigated, time and time again. And as I've said in previous broadcasts, no evidence, no whiff of corruption has ever come to light. We had that extraordinary revelation of, that attempt about a week ago to create a fuss around his tax returns. And even the New York Times couldn't find anything really bad about his tax returns. So, this is on a completely different scale. This is real corruption. I mean, this is real corruption. So in this kind of situation, anybody who's under suspicion of something like that is obviously not a fit person to become president. Even if these allegations can in time be refuted in some way, which I can't see how they can be, but even if they could be, the very fact that he is under suspicion of them now makes Joe Biden a completely inappropriate person to be elected president of the United States in November. So logically, he ought to pull out. We will see if that happens.
Okay, so, maybe I kind of agree with you. Perhaps the Democrats and the elites and the globalists are so drunk on power and they feel that they're so untouchable that they thought, we could run this Biden guy and we'll have the mainstream media and the social media cover our tracks. So even if a guy like Alex or Alexander sits there and writes an article on the Duran, don't worry about it. We'll scrub it. Google will put it all the way back in their search engine results, which they do for us all the time.
All the time, yeah.
All the time. We'll take their videos and we'll suppress them and no one will ever know. And at the end of the day, we'll call them conspiracy theorists or Putin puppets or whatever else they smear us with. So that may be the case. Maybe they just did not think that Hunter Biden would be so galactically stupid to put photos of himself with a crack pipe while sleeping, or to have all these emails saved on a computer that he dropped off at the repair shop and decided to never pick up.
Well, this
I
is
mean,
exactly.
maybe they just don't think these people that stupid.
Well,
And another quick, yeah,
they
go
don't. They
ahead.
don't think in that way. I mean, again, if you've been involved, as I have been, you know, if you've kept track of criminal operations and criminal undertakings, as I have definitely seen happen, that's the kind of thing that people like that's the kind of mistake people like that make. The one thing they never calculate, they usually come up with all these elaborate cover-ups and schemes and plans and things. It's the honest computer repairman in Delaware that they never manage to think through in their very elaborate calculations. That's where they always go wrong. They play these very elaborate chess games, but of course people are not just, you know, chess pieces. There is always, sooner or later, the honest and reliable computer repairman in Delaware who will bring the whole thing, the whole, you know, castle of nonsense down on their heads. So that's the thing they never calculate. That's the kind of mistake they always make, and which always ultimately leads to their downfall.
Right. You know, there's patriotic, honest Americans out there that are just they're not gonna take this crap.
Well,
And
of course
like you
they're
said,
not.
it's that computer repairman that says when he hears 3.5 million from the
Yeah.
Moscow mayor's wife getting wired to Hunter Biden, and believe me, 3.5 million is probably like a cup of coffee for me and you to these guys. With the and I want you to document how much money you think probably flowed through Ukraine, but they never expected that computer repairman to say, you know what? Screw this. I'm handing this this laptop over. So how much money, Alexander, do you think actually passed through Ukraine and was laundered from Ukraine from inside Ukraine, the front door, back door out of Ukraine through Cyprus, Latvia, and back to the US or the EU capital? Let's not leave the EU out of this.
Absolutely. The EU is centrally involved. Well, last year, which was the last time I looked at the figures, I calculated that grants from governments, Western governments, the IMF, and various big organizations came to at least $40 billion since 2014. But of course, since then, more money has been thrown at Ukraine. It sounds extraordinary, but it has been. And of course, that doesn't include the kind of money that I've just been talking about. The $40 billion doesn't include lots of funds that have been provided, not so much to the Ukrainian government, but to various Ukrainian para-state institutions, like, the Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian judiciary. They get grants all the time from all sorts of people, running into tens upon hundreds upon billions of dollars, all supposedly intended to create a civil society in Ukraine. This is always the propaganda that's given. But of course, what it does, it's the revolving door. It goes in and it goes straight out. And it also there's been lots of money that I know about, which has been sunk into the Ukrainian banking system. The Ukrainian banking system came very close to total collapse in the winter of 2014, 2015. The currency crashed. The country was almost on the verge of bankruptcy, and there were real problems in the banking system. And it looked as if the whole banking system was about to collapse, and the whole of Ukraine was, the sort of economy Ukraine has was about to go down with it. So a lot of money, again, was pumped into the Ukraine's banking system to keep it going. Now, bear in mind, when we're talking about a banking system in Ukraine, the major, biggest bank in Ukraine at that time was a bank owned by an oligarch called Igor Kolomoisky, who is, corrupt, again, beyond the dreams of, corruption. I mean, absolutely, Privat bank. And in fact, even the Ukrainian authorities called him corrupt. Even the IMF calls him corrupt. So you put money into a bank owned by a person like that, well, of course, a lot of it will end up, all kinds of interesting offshore accounts in offshore islands, and that's the way that would work. So even after that rescue of the banks, which took place in 2014, 2015, Privat Bank was seen as just so corrupt that the Ukrainian government finally and eventually took it over in a completely corrupt way, by the way. But that's another story.
Yeah, they have an office in Cyprus, and
Absolutely,
I believe he has a Cypriot passport.
Absolutely. I mean, in summary, I wouldn't. If you're talking about how much money went into Ukraine after 2014 in total, I don't think you'd get much change out of 100 billion. That's a guess. That's a guess.
No wonder they wanted to take over that country. They knew.
Well,
they knew what they were doing. Yeah,
absolutely.
So on our other channel, and thank you to everybody who got the other channel to 10,000 subscribers. Go to that channel, Alex Christoforou, subscribe to it. Let's get to 20,000 subscribers in a little less than a month. We got to 10K. But in that other channel, Alexander, I read a story from Zero Hedge, which talked about Devon Archer.
Yeah,
Devon Archer was involved in another scheme, which supposedly Hunter Biden isn't connected to, though he was name dropped.
Yeah.
And in that scheme, he set up a fund where he ripped off Native Americans in the United States of $60 million in bonds and in bond investments. Yeah. $60 million he ripped them off. And he was going to go to prison, but an Obama judge ruled against it. And that rule has been overturned. And now I believe in January, Devon Archer will go to his sentencing hearing. And he could be on the hook for up to 20 years in prison. But they're saying he'll get 3 to 5, but he could be on the hook for 20 years in prison. He's definitely going to prison. This Obama judge, by the way, her husband, from what I understand, is connected to someone in the Mueller investigation. I believe was a college buddy of someone on the Mueller team, and worked in the Obama DOJ.
Well, there you go. I mean, it's all friends looking after each other. But can I just say very quickly? I mean, it's most interesting. I mean, first of all, about this case. I mean, I obviously don't know the details, but when people go abroad and behave incredibly corruptly in other countries, they don't stop being corrupt when they come back home. I mean, that's what corruption does to you. You become corrupt. You become cynical and ruthless, and you start seeing other people not as your fellow citizens, not as people, who you owe a responsibility to as your fellow citizens, but as potential patsies that you can steal money from. I mean, that's the nature of corruption. I mean, you don't go to Ukraine and be corrupt in Ukraine and then come back to the United States and somehow metamorphose into an honest man. That just doesn't happen. I mean, and that's, I think, the first thing to say about this case. And I say that without knowing much about the details. But a more interesting point is, of course, if Devon Archer is indeed going to go to prison, which it seems as if he will, then I do wonder whether, given that I am pretty sure that he doesn't want to go to prison, that he might start thinking about ways of getting out or staying out of prison by, in fact, sharing things that he knows about people. That does happen. So let's just wait and see, because I am sure that Devon Archer knows an awful lot. He needs to be very careful, though, because as we know, people who know too much, and a certain person with the initials JE might be able to confirm this, people who know too much and go to prison don't do very well there.
Point taken. John Kerry, what do you think his involvement is in all of this? He was Secretary of State during the coup, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. He was very much so involved as Secretary of State. He knew exactly what was going on. All of these people, I mean, I said that people like Jeffrey Byatt, the ambassador, and Victoria Nuland, the assistant secretary, who were heavily involved in orchestrating the coup in Ukraine, were answering to Joe Biden, but their direct superior was Kerry, who was, of course, the Secretary of State. So Kerry is, of course, fully aware of all that is going on. He knew exactly who was doing what to whom, and he was absolutely involved in everything. And, I'm going to say it straightforwardly, I would not be in the slightest bit surprised if he was also in some way connected to all of this. Note, by the way, that we're talking about immensely rich people anyway. I mean, we're talking about the Heinz family. We're talking about Kerry. Kerry's a very rich man, American aristocracy. We're talking about, Biden. Biden, was Joe Biden was, the representative of the credit card industry, the senator for Delaware, senator for the credit cards, as they say, very well connected to Wall Street, all of those things. So we're talking about people who are already very, very wealthy and very, very well connected, but who saw opportunities to make even more money. And that perhaps tells you a great deal about what has happened to the elites of the United States. I mean, they are like the elites in the last years of the Roman Republic, where Roman senators went abroad, stole everything they could in the provinces, came back home and became utterly corrupt when they were at home, and aggrandized ever more power, and in the end destroyed the Republic.
Yeah, U.S. taxpayer money, Alexander.
Absolutely.
And EU taxpayer money. And I would like you to talk a little bit about the EU and its involvement in Ukraine, because their hands are not clean. And I'll just give you a real quick backstory. You mentioned that I started writing about this stuff way, way back in 2013, 14. And I started writing about this stuff, Alexander, and I think you know why, because I was so upset after the European Union came and closed down the Cyprus bank. They closed down the one bank. They raided everyone's bank account, and pretty much overnight they set everyone's bank account to zero. So whatever money you had in there on a Friday, you woke up on a Saturday and you had nothing there. So the EU confiscated money from people's personal bank accounts. And then they put us under their troika, loan repayment programs. And all that would have been needed for Cyprus to have been made whole would have been somewhere along the lines of 10 to 15 billion. And that would have saved the one bank and kept us out of a financial meltdown. The EU refused to give it. At the same time, at the same exact time, now keep in mind, Cyprus is part of the EU. At the same exact time, they went to Ukraine, they put sanctions on Russia, and they handed to Ukraine 20 billion like that. What the EU, and the EU was deeply involved in the coup in Ukraine. The EU was up to no good in Ukraine as well.
Absolutely.
We just don't have the goods on them yet.
No, we don't. Can I just make a further point, by the way, just to explain to our viewers the fundamental difference between Ukraine and Cyprus is that Cyprus then and Cyprus now had a functioning and has a functioning and viable economy. If it had been loaned $15 billion, it would have paid it back. It would have been able to pay it back. And in fact, all that crisis would have been avoided, and Cyprus would have been rescued, and it would have paid the money back. Ukraine is never going to pay the money back. The money isn't being sent to Ukraine with any intention that it ever will be paid back. Now, let's come to the EU. The EU is a massive accessory in this disaster. And we know about the corruption that American officials got up to, or rather, American, not officials necessarily, but, the sons and the children of American officials got up to in Ukraine. We don't know to anything like the same degree about what the Europeans have been up to, but I am going to be pretty sure that it's actually at least as bad and quite possibly worse. The United States, for all its many faults and problems, continues to be a much more open society than Europe is. Any part of Europe is. So you can be sure that all kinds of Germans and French and British people have been off to Ukraine, doing very well for themselves there at the expense of the taxpayers of their own countries, and we don't know about it. And they've been no doubt opening so-called quasi factories and businesses, which aren't really factories and they aren't really businesses, but they get, grants and supports from their own governments to open them. And of course, it all goes straight into their pockets, and then straight from those pockets into offshore accounts in all sorts of places. I know that that goes on because I would remind our viewers that I live in London, which is the clearinghouse for all that kind of thing. And I know people who are familiar with the kind of things that happen in that famous London clearinghouse. Now, as for the politics of it, remember how it all began. It was with an association agreement that the European Union was trying to force upon Ukraine, which was intended to break Ukraine away from Russia's economic orbit, which it succeeded in doing. They managed to persuade, with the help of a gentleman known as Paul Manafort, they managed to persuade Viktor Yanukovych and Podesta.
You can't make this up.
No,
you can't make this up.
They were able to persuade Yanukovych to go for this disastrous association agreement when Yanukovych, who was the so-called pro-Russian president, the elected constitutional president, by the way, of Ukraine, had second thoughts because he suddenly realized that there wasn't very much in it for Ukraine with this deal, and tried to reverse course. The Europeans played an absolutely pivotal role in engineering his removal. The protests that took place in Ukraine in the autumn of 2013 and in the winter of 2014 were called Euromaidan. It was Euromaidan, and there were the European flags, and there were European officials coming along to support them. And when there was a final deal that was brokered between President Yanukovych and the so-called Euromaidan opposition, it was the Europeans who supposedly brokered it. The German foreign minister, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, who is now the president of Germany, Radek Sikorski, who was the foreign minister of Poland. They all came along. They brokered this deal. Carl Bildt, who was the foreign minister of Sweden, he was also involved. All of those people were involved. And of course, it ended in a total complete disaster for Ukraine. It ended in a civil war, in an uprising, in the collapse of the Ukrainian economy, in the impoverishment of the Ukrainian people, and, as Alex rightly said, a massive crisis, unresolved crisis between Russia and the European Union, which continues and gets worse almost with every year. So the European Union played a massive role in this. They sacrificed the interests of their own member states, members like Cyprus. They sacrificed the interests of many of their businesses because, of course, businesses like, say, the Roquefort cheese industry in France, to give an example, had built up major economic links with Russia. Russians didn't make blue cheese, believe it or not, before then. They hadn't any idea what blue cheese was. They were importing it from France, from the European Union. All of that was sacrificed as part of this geopolitical project in Ukraine, but it was a geopolitical project out of which some people made an awful lot of money. And since we're talking about Europeans, let's not forget that the head of the IMF, who was instrumental in providing all those loans, was Christine Lagarde, former finance minister of France.
And now,
isn't she ahead of the European Central Bank? I mean, the amazing thing about Christine Lagarde, by the way, who's also been indicted, or rather, I think, convicted of corruption charges in France, is that she fails in every operation she undertakes, and goes on ever higher. I mean, she rises and rises the more she fails. But of course, she doesn't fail for some people.
You know what the lesson is in Ukraine, Alexander, and in Europe and in the US is that the elites and the globalists, I'm listening to you, and all the businesses they destroyed with the sanctions and with the geopolitical games they played in Ukraine in order to enrich themselves.
Yes.
Is that the globalists and the elites and the politicians, and this is relevant today.
Yeah.
This is relevant right now as we speak, as we're all sitting wherever we are in the world together talking about this. The globalists and the elites will do whatever it takes, including shutting down their businesses, shutting down their schools, sending their people into poverty, if it means they will enrich themselves.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is it. We have a completely predatory global elite. The reason they are so predatory is because they are a globalized elite. They don't have any sense of allegiance to their own countries. They are against nation states. They don't believe in nation states, and they don't have any feeling of shared citizenship with the people of their countries. I mean, the robber barons of the United States in the 19th century, people like, J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, all these people who we've heard so many stories about. They may have been, pretty ruthless and in their own way pretty corrupt, but they were Americans. They felt a tremendous sense of loyalty to the United States. So that's why, with all their corruption and all the rest, they built up the United States. They did feel they were part of the United States. Today's globalized elite does not. It will sacrifice anything in its own interests because it feels no sense of responsibility towards anyone. And that is a fundamental difference. And it's not something, by the way, that has ever happened before.
And it's relevant today. It's
And
relevant today, and everyone knows exactly what I mean. Alexander, 2 more points, and we'll get to some super chats. And I think these are very important points, points. First of all, Manafort, you mentioned him. Manafort was Obama's guy, not Trump's guy in Ukraine. Please explain.
Yes, he was somehow managed. They managed to make him, the political advisor of President Yanukovych. This is the person we're always told is the pro-Russian president of Ukraine. He appointed Manafort on the basis that Manafort would be the person who would improve Yanukovych's image in the West. He was brought in as a sort of image consultant come lobbyist. What actually happened was that Manafort worked on behalf of the US. He was intimately involved with the US embassy, with people like Jeffrey Pyatt, and his job was to try to get Yanukovych to take Ukraine away from its historic political and economic relationship with Russia and reorient it to the West. This idea of an association agreement between Ukraine and the European Union, an association agreement which would have been incompatible with Ukraine's previous relationship with Russia, that was cooked up by various people in the West, but it was Manafort who sold it to Yanukovych. He sold it to Yanukovych. He persuaded Yanukovych to go for it, and he did it on behalf of the Obama administration, which was then in power in the United States.
All right, let's circle back to the United States with 2 more points. The Maidan coup was largely funded, and I think it's common knowledge now, this is not conspiracy theory, I think this is absolute fact, by George Soros and his NGOs, his universities, his Open Democracy Foundation, all these things. George Soros is up to a lot of no good in the United States. We are 3 weeks away from the elections. Your thoughts, Alexander?
Well, this is the point. Again, it's a point which we've discussed many times in our broadcasts. What happens inevitably is that if people like Soros and all these other people go off to other countries and engineer regime changes of government in those countries, sooner or later they will bring back that technology, if you like, back to the United States and will apply it there. And bearing in mind that all of these people that we're talking about are either members of this globalist elite, which we were talking about, or are people who see themselves as the servants of that globalist elite, inevitably they will act against governments or presidents or politicians like, say, Donald Trump, who want to bring back sovereignty, if you like, to the United States, who want to re-emphasize the United States as a nation, as as a political republic, a republic that is there for the people, for and by the American people. So that is exactly what those kind of people are against. So they will work very hard to prevent it happening, and they will bring back all those tools that they've perfected abroad, and they will use them in the United States. And that is exactly what we've been seeing. We've been seeing it with Russiagate. We've been seeing it with all these orchestrated protests that happened under the BLM umbrella over the course of the summer. And we've seen it in the way the news is being manipulated. I mean, Twitter and Facebook and all of those have been used as instruments, by the way, of regime change in many of these countries. There was this uprising in Moldova, which was orchestrated through Twitter, and it was actually called the Twitter Revolution. It happened in 2009, as I very well remember. So, I mean, all of this
trial runs.
Exactly, all of this were trials runs. Inevitably, they are being brought back home, just as the corruption that happens with Americans in places like Ukraine will be brought back home. So the regime change technologies that are applied in places like Ukraine will be brought back home. And that is what is happening in the United States now. We will see whether the political institutions of the American Republic and the devotion to democracy of the American people are strong enough to act as antibodies to resist these forces that are so dangerous to the United States as they have been to the whole world.
Yeah, this is it. The world is looking at the U.S. This is it.
Well, the world is looking at the US.
This is it. Yeah.
And it's important to understand that these people we're talking about, they are not ultimately an American elite, even though most of them are, many of them are Americans. They are a globalist elite, which operates through certain agencies of the United States government.
No, it affects everyone. I mean,
but
the
it
whole
affects
world.
everyone.
Yeah.
It
I mean, I'm looking
everyone.
at the U.S. election, and in my mind, I'm saying, God help us if Biden were to win, because I know that if a Biden presidency does take place, I know the wars that are going to be coming.
Exactly. It is no different.
Wars that will be coming. Yeah, it's going to be awful.
It is no different in Britain. It is no different in Germany. It is no different in every other place. I mean, that is the thing to understand. And they will bring about wars, and they will bring about disasters, because that's how they benefit. That's how they enrich themselves at the expense of everyone.
Yeah. And finally, Alexander, we're going to have one more debate. That's what they're saying. In the first debate with Chris Wallace, Trump had Biden when he started to really go after Biden with the 3.5 million from Moscow. Yeah. Biden was shaken. I mean, he was about to melt. And then Chris Wallace came in and just saved his butt.
Yes.
There is no way they're going to have a debate if Biden doesn't drop out. Because I think it is a very real possibility. Yeah. He may drop out.
Yeah.
If he doesn't drop out, there's no way they can have a debate.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, I can't see how he can be exposed to this kind of questioning by Donald Trump. I mean, I really don't see how. I mean, to be very clear, the non-denial we got today, it's not in my official list of meetings. That doesn't survive in a debate. I mean, that's the kind of evasion that in a debate just falls apart. I mean, you look, if you try and run with it, I mean, you look like a liar.
Yeah. It's, if Biden stays in the campaign, I mean, I can't see him ever leaving his basement.
Yeah, I know. Well, agreed.
And keep in mind, we're waiting for more documents. We're waiting for video.
We're waiting for videos. We're waiting for emails. We're waiting for all kinds of things.
Anyway.